Mr. Speaker, I'm privileged to be the proud owner of a copy of the former Prime Minister's new book. It's a rare, unsigned copy.
But in the budget, which was probably the toughest, I'm really pleased that we were able to put so much money into the National Health Service.
We've got a billionaire Prime Minister and a billionaire Prime Minister, both of whose families have used schemes to avoid millions of pounds of tax, smearing a working-class woman.
In the next few minutes, you'll witness the moment Keir Starmer accused the Prime Minister of misleading the House. You'll see the government's employment bill torn apart, revealing its £5 billion price tag for businesses. And you'll hear Starmer's damning final assessment of the government's failures. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favour. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great. Thank you so much. Now, back to the video. But that's not all. We'll break down the implications of this heated exchange, explore what it means for small businesses across the UK, and analyse how this could impact the political landscape moving forward. Ready to dive into the heart of British politics? The Prime Minister's confident defence of the employment bill began to crumble as Keir Starmer unleashed a barrage of damning evidence in the Commons.
And rather than sit around, we've got them all together today to talk to Angela and to me and to Rachel Reeves.
She claims the Tory party's disastrous kamikaze budget that triggered chaos for millions was, her words, the happiest moment of her premiership.
Really going to turn something around, you have to do the hard yards up front. Don't look at a tough decision and then leave it for a year or two. So we're doing the tough stuff.
What started as a routine PMQs quickly escalated into a ferocious row, leaving the government's stance in tatters and raising serious questions about the bill's impact on businesses across the UK. At first glance, the Prime Minister seemed assured, touting the bill as a beacon of workers' rights and economic growth. But Starmer, like a seasoned prosecutor, methodically dismantled this facade. He unveiled the bill's eye-watering £5 billion price tag for businesses, a revelation that sent shockwaves through the chamber. How could a government claiming to champion growth saddle businesses with such a hefty burden? The Federation of Small Businesses warning that 92% of small employers are worried about the bill added fuel to the fire. It's a staggering figure that begs the question: is the government truly in touch with the needs of the business community? Or are they pushing through legislation that could strangle the very economic growth they claim to promote? As the debate heated up, the Prime Minister's resolve began to visibly weaken. His attempts to deflect criticism became increasingly desperate, revealing a growing unease with the bill's implications. It was like watching a chess player realize they're 3 moves away from checkmate, frantically looking for an escape that simply isn't there. But Starmer wasn't done. He zeroed in on the bill's potential to become an adventure playground for lawyers. It's a colourful phrase that paints a vivid picture of endless litigation and legal quagmires. For businesses already struggling with rising costs and economic uncertainty, the prospect of increased legal exposure must feel like salt in the wound. The Prime Minister's defence that good work rights are consistent with economic growth began to ring hollow in the face of these revelations. It's a noble sentiment, but when the government's own estimates suggest the changes in clauses 8 and 9 alone could increase business costs by up to £1 billion a year in sick pay, one has to wonder: at what point does the pursuit of workers' rights begin to undermine the very businesses that provide those jobs? Starmer's surgical dissection of the bill continued, highlighting how clauses 1 through 6 could make it harder for businesses to hire new employees. This is particularly concerning for young people seeking their first job. In a job market already fraught with challenges, are we about to erect even more barriers for the next generation of workers? As the Prime Minister struggled to counter these accusations effectively, the mood in the Commons shifted palpably. The government's grand vision for the employment bill began to look less like a well-thought-out policy and more like a potential economic millstone. The implications of this debate stretch far beyond the walls of Westminster. Small business owners across the country must be watching with growing alarm. Will they be forced to raise prices to cover these new costs? Will they have to cut jobs? And how will this impact their ability to compete in an increasingly global marketplace? Starmer's performance in this PMQs was reminiscent of a skilled matador, deftly sidestepping the Prime Minister's arguments and landing precise blows. With each revelation, each accusation of misleading the House, he chipped away at the government's credibility on this issue. As the dust settles on this fiery exchange, one thing is clear. The employment bill, once touted as a cornerstone of the government's economic policy, now stands on shaky ground. The Prime Minister's crumbling defense has exposed deep flaws in its conception and potential implementation. Just when you thought the employment bill debate couldn't get any more heated, Keir Starmer dropped a bombshell that sent shockwaves through the Commons. With the Prime Minister already on the back foot, Starmer unleashed his most damning critique yet, rebranding the controversial legislation as the Unemployment Bill. It's a clever bit of political wordplay, but the implications are far more serious than a mere change of name. Starmer's accusation cuts to the heart of the government's economic policy. He's not just saying the bill is flawed, he's arguing that it's actively harmful to the very people it's meant to help. It's a bold claim, and one that demands closer scrutiny. After all, if Starmer's right, we're looking at a colossal misfire that could have far-reaching consequences for workers and businesses alike. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. What exactly is Starmer's evidence for this dramatic rebranding? Well, it turns out he's got more than a few arrows in his quiver. For starters, he points to a provision in the bill that could allow new employees to take their employers to tribunal on their very first day of work. Now, that might sound like a win for workers' rights at first glance, but think about it for a moment. What employer in their right mind would want to take on that kind of risk? It's not hard to see how this could backfire spectacularly. Small businesses, already struggling with rising costs and economic uncertainty, might think twice about taking on new staff. And let's not forget about young people trying to get their foot in the door of the job market. They're already facing an uphill battle. Do we really want to make it even steeper? But Starmer wasn't done there. He went on to describe the bill as an adventure playground for lawyers. It's a colorful phrase, but it paints a vivid picture of endless litigation and legal quagmires. For businesses already stretched thin, the prospect of increased legal exposure must feel like salt in the wound. And let's be honest, the only people who win in that scenario are the lawyers themselves. The Prime Minister, for his part, seemed to struggle to counter these accusations effectively. His attempts to defend the bill became increasingly desperate as Starmer continued his onslaught. It was like watching a boxer on the ropes, desperately trying to avoid the knockout punch. But perhaps the most damning accusation came when Starmer suggested that the real beneficiaries of this bill aren't workers at all, but trade unions. He pointed to Part 4 of the employment bill, arguing that it represents the largest expansion of trade union powers in a generation. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with strong unions. They've played a crucial role in securing workers' rights throughout history. But if Starmer's right, and this bill is tipping the scales too far in their favor, it could have serious implications for business operations and economic growth. Take Clause 61, for instance. According to Starmer, it reduces the notice period for strikes to just 1 week. Now imagine you're running a business. How do you plan for that kind of disruption on such short notice? It's not hard to see how this could have catastrophic effects, particularly for smaller businesses that don't have the resources to absorb sudden shocks. As the debate reached its fever pitch, you could almost feel the mood in the Commons shift. The government's grand vision for the employment bill, once touted as a cornerstone of their economic policy, now looked more like a potential millstone around the neck of British business. But here's the thing. Most people think this bill is either a triumph for workers' rights or a death knell for small businesses. The truth, as is often the case in politics, is likely somewhere in the middle. Both these views might be overly simplistic. The real impact of this bill could be far more nuanced and far-reaching than either side is willing to admit. Could this bill, ironically dubbed the unemployment bill by its critics, actually create the very problem it's trying to solve? It's a question that should give even the most seasoned political observers pause for thought. After all, if businesses are too scared to hire new staff, if young people can't get their first break, if small enterprises are crushed under the weight of increased costs and legal risks, then who exactly is this bill helping? As the dust settles on this fiery exchange, one thing is clear. The employment bill, and indeed the government's entire approach to workers' rights and economic growth, is now under intense scrutiny. Starmer's performance in this PMQs was reminiscent of a skilled prosecutor, methodically dismantling the government's case piece by piece. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, there's no denying the effectiveness of his attack. As the dust settles on this explosive PMQs, it's clear that the employment bill debate has exposed deep rifts in the government's economic strategy. What started as a routine exchange quickly spiraled into a full-blown political crisis, leaving the Prime Minister's credibility in tatters and Keir Starmer looking like a master strategist. The implications of this clash stretch far beyond the walls of Westminster. Small business owners across the country must be watching with growing alarm. Will they be forced to raise prices to cover these new costs? Will they have to cut jobs? And how will this impact their ability to compete in an increasingly global marketplace? These are questions that demand answers, and fast. But let's not forget the workers in all of this. The employment bill was supposed to be their champion, a beacon of hope in an uncertain economic landscape. Instead, it's become a political football, kicked back and forth between opposing sides with little regard for the people it's meant to help. It's no wonder that public trust in politicians is at an all-time low. The Prime Minister's crumbling defense has exposed deep flaws in the bill's conception and potential implementation. It's a stark reminder of the complexities of governance and the pitfalls of rushed legislation. But it also raises questions about the competence of those in power. How did a bill with such glaring issues make it this far? Who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes? Keir Starmer's performance in this PMQs was nothing short of masterful. Like a seasoned prosecutor, he methodically dismantled the government's case piece by piece. His rebranding of the employment bill as the unemployment bill was a stroke of political genius, one that's likely to stick in the public consciousness for some time to come. But here's the thing. Most people think this bill is either a triumph for workers' rights or a death knell for small businesses. The truth, as is often the case in politics, is likely somewhere in the middle. Both these views might be overly simplistic. The real impact of this bill could be far more nuanced and far-reaching than either side is willing to admit. As we move forward, both parties face significant challenges in convincing the public of their vision for Britain's economic future. The government needs to rebuild trust and prove that they're not just serving special interests. Meanwhile, Labour needs to show that they have viable alternatives, not just criticism. This debate has exposed the tensions at the heart of British politics. On one side, we have a government struggling to balance workers' rights with economic growth. On the other, an opposition party eager to paint them as out of touch and incompetent. It's a microcosm of the larger ideological battle that's been raging in the UK for decades. But let's not lose sight of what's really at stake here. This isn't just about political point scoring or who comes out on top in the next opinion poll. It's about the livelihoods of millions of British workers and the future of countless small businesses. It's about the kind of society we want to build and the values we want to prioritise. As we wrap up our analysis of this explosive PMQs, one thing is clear. The political landscape in Britain is shifting. The old certainties are crumbling, and new battle lines are being drawn. Whether this will lead to meaningful change or just more of the same old partisan bickering remains to be seen.